You're listening to the Decentered Media podcast with me, Rob Watson. Conversations about community media. Visit decentered.co.uk or follow on Instagram and Twitter at Decentered Media. Hello, it is Monday the 14th of July 2025 and this is a Decentered Media podcast with me, Rob Watson, and today I'm joined by Kajal Nisha Patel. How are you, Kajal?
I'm very well, thanks, Rob.
We thought we'd just get together for a chat because we kind of found ourselves over the last couple of months, and we've got a number of things in common, I think, in terms of an emerging idea of social engagement. I don't want to give any surprises away. Not that there's much to give away, but it's kind of the kind of an outlook on how we maybe can do media in better ways and social engagement with media in better ways. And I just wanted to kind of see if we could draw on each other's experience to kind of knock around a few ideas of where we think we are, what we think we can do, and how we can kind of develop this as maybe a model that can be rolled out and used elsewhere. So I always start out, we're at the, just in case anybody is hearing lots of noises in the background, we are at the LCB depot in Leicester, and there's a few people having conversations. There's people emptying their mop buckets, so you've got sound effects as well today. So do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself? Tell us your potted story of what you do. How did you get into doing what you do?
Okay, so I guess it might make sense to tell you a little bit of what I consider to be my dream work and then my money work. So I've spent the best part of the last 2 decades as a visual artist, and that has manifested in photojournalism, documentary storytelling, filmmaking. But then over the last 10 years, I've been working more with communities. I have been working with communities since the beginning, really, but in a more academic context with communities for the last 10 years, where it's been a bit more research informed. And so, yeah, I've been working in community context with other mediums, in textiles and sculpture, with art galleries, and I got my master's in socially engaged practice. I got that in 2022, and I also work as a yoga teacher as well. So that is also with the community, of course, and that's a good way for me to take care of myself while taking care of others as well. But that also works as part of the socially engaged practice. So that's kind of weaving into the money work now, I guess. And my professional work is also in academia. I've just left an academic position as a communications officer for the Centre for Ethnic Health Research, where I also organise a project called the Global Health Research Centre for India and Nepal. So that was quite an exciting project, looking at working with low to middle income countries and giving them support in knowledge mobilisation and supporting them to set up research centres within their own contexts.
Okay, so we've got an awful lot to unpack. Let's have a meander around all of this. Let's start off with the hard question. What have you learned?
What have I learned? I mean, I suppose let's take this back to the community work, because that's essentially why I'm doing all this in the first place. So I guess when I started out in the community, my goal was to share some of my practice with the people that I met, because I'd personally found art and art making to be so therapeutic, and it's that thing of when you find something so lovely, you want to share it with the people that you care about. My own family didn't seem that interested, so I thought, let me take it out into the community instead. And that has really followed me up until the present day. The way I do things now is a lot different to how I used to do it. Obviously, the world has changed in the last 2 decades quite a lot. So going back to your question about what I've learned, is the main thing is to not have any expectations, that we're all on a learning journey, and in the beginning, especially when it comes to funded projects, that there's this expectation, and a lot of the time I think it's self-imposed, that we have to deliver these all singing, all dancing projects, which is going to look really good for the funders and hopefully get you more funding as well. So I guess the expectation that I would put on myself, but also I felt like it was coming from the funders, I've let go of that expectation now. I see every single project that I do as a learning experience, and I try and do my best, and I don't worry too much if it doesn't go as perfectly planned as I hoped it would. So it takes the pressure off, and it's certainly good for my nervous system.
So give us an example of how you're going to take that forward, or a project that you've kind of come to see and go through the life cycle of development to fruition, and now reflection, even beyond the evaluation that you have to put in place in terms of what you would hope to develop and kind of demonstrate that you're bringing these threads together.
Thank you. I'm in the process of delivering a project which is in its second iteration at the moment. It's called Waste to Wellbeing. The first iteration was online during COVID, and it was an experimental project which weaved together, as I said, waste to wellbeing. So the idea is that wellbeing is not just one yoga class and you're fixed kind of thing. It was looking at a more holistic approach to how we can live more in harmony with ourselves, with nature, mental, physical, emotional, psychological, those kinds of things. So we were trying to give them a real sample of different ways that they could actually bring themselves into the present moment. So it's using a lot of practices that are rooted in yoga, but then we also wanted to give people an idea of the psychology and more current kind of conversations in the mental health sector as well. So we had mental health experts speaking to people as well. And so, like I said, it was an online project, but now we are doing the first version, which is in person, with a very different group, an elderly Indian women's group. And again, really moving into the co-creation space, because I think co-creation is often misunderstood. Co-creation is used quite a lot in funding, the funding landscape, and it's really, for me, confronting what does that actually mean. Are we sharing power, resources, or access to power and resources? So we try to give the community a whole, we wanted them to actually design the project and for them to choose what they were going to do. So that's what we've done, and it's working out quite well so far. So in terms of fast forwarding, how has that evolved? Again, obviously because it was COVID online, now it's really testing the waters in terms of how does that look in real life, and especially with a really different group of people like elderly Indian women. It's quite difficult. We've got a session tomorrow which is on neurodiversity with that particular group, so that's quite a difficult subject to discuss anyway, even within academia. The job that I just left, I am neurodiverse myself, and I really struggled to communicate what my needs were, and that's not for lack of trying. I think the capitalist system is not really designed for empathy, so it really just requires patience and empathy to try to understand what neurodiversity even is. So to try to bring those conversations into a context where, how do you talk about something like that to a group of women who first English isn't their first language? I mean, they're very good. It's not that they can't understand English, but it's really getting the current debates that are happening and helping them to understand how that might be affecting their lives. So again, it's moving through those mental, physical, neurological issues, but also trauma as well, how trauma might be coming up for them in today. So I'm not really sure if I answered your question, but that's where I'm at the moment.
I've got summer cough at the moment. So there's a different model of a different set of expectations based around this idea of care, which is, and there's a dictum that I've used for quite a few years now, which I didn't create. It was Nell Noddings who put it together. It's like we should be. It's not what we care about; it's what we care for that we need to address. And what you're describing is a shift in thinking from that kind of instrumental, kind of transactional. You're looking at the outcomes, what you're going to get. So actually, there's a kind of model at the moment, which is I kind of go through stages where you put things into very binary forms, and it's parasitic and, or what's the opposite of parasitic? It's symbiotic, and the parasitic model is very much dominant at the moment. It's like you take what you want out of it, you extract all of the social value, the economic value, the environmental value, whatever it is, you extract all of that and you leave an empty husk, discarded husk, and you move on to the next thing, and you do it for yourself and you're not really bothered about anybody else. Whereas the more socially responsible, environmentally responsible model is to think, well, actually we're taking value from something. How do we replenish and how do we secure it for the future, rather than just kind of using it all up now and then not having anything in the future that we can value. So what I want to try and think about in that kind of model of care is how is media in your experience, because you've been involved with you are an arts practitioner and you've done photography as a practice, and you're involved with radio station. And just kind of talk around those issues in terms of how it's not everybody's first expectation to think about care, empathy, and social responsibility. It's often seen as being the kind of the knit your own shoes, nut munching, guardianistas. And actually, that's a complete misrepresentation, because it doesn't have to be that kind of wishy-washy kind of tokenism, which is often kind of expressed as its worst, and can sometimes be self-fulfilling as well. But so tell us a bit about your street photography, because you started off as a street photographer, and it helped you to do what? Having that engagement outside with people in the world. What did that do?
I guess you could say that as an artist, I'm kind of working through the different sensory apparatus, the 5 senses that we have: sight, sound, smell, touch and taste. And I work a lot more with the following the 4 that I just repeated before now with the yoga, whereas my first engagement with the world was visual. And that's really where photography was. I guess for me, that was my strongest sense, and so for others, it might be sound. For yourself, it's probably sound, right? And so I guess that was just naturally what felt right to me. There was just something about the camera. It just got me. I've made work on this as well. It was a big fixture in my family. My mum used to love taking photographs, and I think that was what influenced me to take photographs in the first place. But it just felt very, very natural for me to start taking photographs, and I live in a city, so it kind of evolved it started when I went to India originally. I'd not been to India for a long time, and so I'd gone to visit family and spending time with family who I hadn't actually spent that much time before, and I was just observing what was happening. And my visit before that had been a good 10-12 years, so it was a big gap. And so I was just noticing how India had changed, and there was a heavier influence of televisions. My previous visits weren't, I don't remember that many televisions being around, for instance. So I just started photographing my family, doing what they do. And then when I got back to England, I started then, I suppose, rinse and repeat and taking photographs, not necessarily of my family, but it was of the community, the wider community in Leicester, in Belgrave Road. So I did that for the best part of like 10-12 years. And that project was called The Golden Mile. And yeah, so I guess my lens was getting wider, you could say. You know, I'd gone from looking at the internal to the external in a way, sort of my family to the community, the Indian community, because I live near Braunston, so I didn't grow up around a lot of Asian people. But when I went into Belgrave, there was a familiarity of the cultures and the smells and the people, and I tried to capture all that. But then I did, you know, a few different projects. I was toing and froing from India, so I was looking really at rural to urban migration. And I was also photographing some of the dilapidated factories as well. So that project was called Trade, and, you know, looking at the crumbling infrastructure of the city. And because my mother was a machinist, and I spent a lot of time in those hosiery factories when I was growing up. So I was really interested in my relationship to the land as the child of an immigrant, and, you know, what kind of claim, in a way, I have over the cultural history of Leicester. And so I kind of felt, I mean, I didn't really think about that at the time, but I felt like I had some sort of, I guess it was belonging that I was looking for. You know, you're always kind of trying to root yourself wherever. Well, I was anyway. And so that was the first attempt with the family and then the community. But then when I started photographing the factories, I really saw that relationship that I had to the land and the history of England, you know. So that was really profound for me.
Yeah. In what way? What was that relationship like? What was that about? What was the connecting point? Or disconnecting point?
It was definitely more of a connecting point, actually, because, you know, as you know, an individualized unit walking through the world, you know, I saw myself as a pretty small, insignificant part of the world, I suppose. Well, you know, I didn't really think about it like that at the time, but when you start to, you know, I did silly things. I was walking into asbestos-filled factories and things like that. That's what I was doing. I was young. But, you know, when you sort of look at your own kind of self in those grand spaces, and there was a kind of freedom that came with, you know, going through those spaces, first of all, but also looking at me in context to the buildings themselves. And it wasn't necessarily buildings that my mum had worked in, but it didn't really make that much difference. You know, the fact of the matter is I kind of could see a stronger relationship to how my parents had contributed to the economy and things like that. And I was finding really interesting things within these old buildings. There was an old pair of tights, like hosiery tights. This factory, obviously, they made tights. And then I found out that they would have made parachutes for, you know, in the Second World War, and, you know, an offshoot of that would have been hosiery tights, you know. So I guess I was interested in the products of capitalism and feminism, and how there's a soft kind of element to war and, you know, the war machine, and how there was this packet of old ladies' tights within this old factory. And you think, look at the kind of sinister nature of these buildings. But my relationship to the factories had always been kind of soft in a way, because my memories of being in those buildings were when my mum was there, and during lunchtime they'd all be sharing their food and things like that. So I suppose your lens and your kind of understanding of the world, or my understanding of the world, started to get bigger and bigger. But at the same time, there was this really intimate connection that I was having with the stories that were contained within the objects I was finding, and the windows and the views as well. I was looking out of the windows and just seeing more grey buildings, and I was like, wow, these are the kind of... I couldn't imagine what that was like, coming to this country and spending your working days in those buildings. But it also was quite healing, in that I started to understand why my parents were so impatient, I guess. It must have been very difficult for them to have lived in such a disempowering environment. And this is something I talk about a lot, the politics of power, and how that then influences the dynamics within the familial structure. Yeah, so that was quite healing. I think I developed a lot of empathy for my own parents and what they'd been through after seeing the environments they would literally spend all their days in. And my dad, he worked as an electrical engineer, but, you know, I found all his logbooks. He's a meticulous record keeper, and I could see all of the hours that he'd worked, and there were, you know, most of the time he was working 70-hour weeks, you know, and he'd kept a really detailed log of all that. So it just, yeah, it was quite humbling to see that.
And the vehicle for this was the photography, and that you've got a very strong sense of imagination that you're able to express, which comes from the what did the photography do itself that you it's obviously it's giving you a perspective on a situation that you then kind of constructed, if you like, or reconstructed what your naive view was to what your more informed view was, which is supplemented with conversations and looking at other forms of records. But the actual act of going out with a camera, what can you recall about that process?
I mean, it made me stand still for just a minute. If it was only for trying to get a really nice composition, you know, I would spend ages trying to get the most geometric lines, and that in itself was a way for me to just stay still for a moment. And I guess I come from quite a chaotic environment, and just being able to stand there and, you know, still, and I guess just, I don't know how much photography your viewers have done, but when you're standing there with it was quite heavy, and the camera's quite heavy, so you have to literally balance yourself and stand there for a while and really think about what is coming through the lens. And, you know, from a purely aesthetic kind of on a purely aesthetic level, you're trying to make things look beautiful. And, you know, a lot of the times the photographs, you know, what I was looking at wasn't that beautiful, because it was literally a huge open room with, you know, rubble on the floor and things like that. So you're trying to compose and make a very beautiful image out of something that, like I said, the asbestos-filled building. So that in itself, you start to appreciate the beauty of these kind of mundane situations. So, but also, like I said, it brings you into stillness for a while. So that's what it brought to me in the moment. But then also, obviously, it helped me to connect with my community as well, because I was then sharing the images and whatever I was doing with friends. And, you know, I had quite a supportive online community during a lot of this time. The factory stuff, it was a little bit later, and I wasn't really sharing as much of that, but the things I was doing around Belgrove, that was shared on a huge international website, which it was legendary at the time. It's how I learned photography. I didn't go to any photography classes, but I did meet some very interesting local photographers. And the CEO of Charnwood Arts, Kev Ryan at the time, who's sadly passed away, but he became a huge supporter of my work. And he gave me exhibition opportunities, and I found other friends through this network who really supported my ideas, and they listened to me talk about things. So it gave me a peer group, you could say, where I could talk about things that other people may not want to.
So now when you undertake your arts practice work and your facilitation work and your professional communications work, which you've done, does that, what you learnt from those photography, that from the inside, do you carry that with you into those other tasks and roles? Is that something that you, I mean, for example, you know, it's kind of, I was talking to somebody the other day, they said, you know, kind of, we'll organise an event, you could do the podcast, Rob. And I said, no, I'll teach people how to do the podcast. I don't want to be doing the podcast. I want other people to be doing the podcast. Because I've learned what from doing this process of doing the podcast, it's not about me. It's about what other people can learn, I hope, from the process, what other people can learn from wandering about with a camera in the way that you do, or with a sound recorder in the way that you do. What have you carried? What does that centre what you do in other regards? Does it enable you to, you know, there's a conflict, a tension between people want communications to fulfill certain tasks, and actually that's not meaningful communication. Meaningful communication is that point where somebody looks at a photograph or reads something or engages with something in a way which affects them and moves them and changes their perspective, whereas most of what we we live in a world which is just awash with information. What have you been able to kind of employ that?
That's a great question, Rob, and
I know, I wish I knew the answer as well.
I mean, but I don't know if there is a universal right answer, but for me, it's kind of shifting that perspective from consumer to producer. And, this is the reality of the situation, especially when you're doing the money work, which I have been doing for the last 18 months, professionally as a communications manager. And there is this expectation of production and, to meet the, demands of capitalism, essentially. And, I'm sure the departments wouldn't necessarily see it as a capitalist product, but it is, because you're working within a neoliberal university where there are expectations to be fulfilled.
Well, they're the most capitalist places now.
Precisely. Yeah.
I mean, even capitalism doesn't do what British universities, modern Western universities have done. Capitalism ditches a lot of the stuff that they do, so it's they're behind.
Well, exactly, and there are obviously we could do a whole chapter on this in itself. But I mean, working for the life sciences was very different to other departments I've done artist commissions for, which are more about the humanities and the social sciences, and I was really spoiled in those spaces where I got to express myself, and there was more of a critique of the material that I was producing as an artist, and it wasn't necessarily about consuming it and in a very fast way where it was, you would produce this stuff and then it would be gone, sort of thing. There was more contemplation, and you got to have these kind of conversations within cultural spaces where you were speaking to people who were actively working on the same sort of things as you were. But I think it was almost like I had to drag and drop my creative skills into the capitalist world, and I was very aware of that a few years ago as well when I started as a photographer, that I guess designers and creative people are, many of them, I'm guessing, probably started off with a real creative passion, but then it's applying those creative skills in the capitalist world. And I guess I was quite spoiled in that sense, where I did work freelance for 20 years and I was able to continue expressing myself, but then reality bites, and I had to then find ways to apply those creative skills in a more kind of capitalist world, and I really grappled with that. I grappled with the thing I grappled with the most is not being seen for the value that I could actually bring in trying to, and this sounds a little bit left field, but it makes sense in my head that as a yoga instructor, my job is to help people to slow down, to experience the present moment, which is exactly the same as what I'm trying to do with the work that I make as an artist. So it's a harder sell. The art is a harder sell, especially when you're trying to sell it, quote unquote, sell it within outside of the art and cultural sector. I think people like to look at beautiful pictures, but they don't necessarily always understand what art is trying to do. Yoga is a lot easier because people are physically in pain and they're coming and you can help them to literally be still for a moment. But really the job that I'm doing, and in fact, even as a yoga instructor, I describe myself more as an artist, because the artistry comes from me being able to help people to actually feel something, So, so going back to your question about how to actually, I can't remember exactly what the question was, but it was something around applying the art within the capitalist. Yeah, did I answer the question?
Yeah, the kind of process-driven machine of automated communications, and it's very much interested in. My motivation for Decentered Media is in a distributed environment where there are choices, there are alternatives. I think the stress comes from when people think that you can only do things one way, and as soon as you articulate and say, no, there are other ways to do this. It's like the thing that comes to mind when you said about, yoga for the body is both for the body and the mind, but art is both for the body and the mind, and the mental pain and torture that we're in. That's why good art, kind of engages in a way is like a form of psychotherapeutic yoga, and the two are connected. There is a relationship between the two. But I think we don't have the language to talk about it, and I read a lot of social reports which are kind of come out, and there's the stuff about social cohesion, and the stuff about inequality, and the stuff about kind of racial equality, and the whole range of kind of social justice, equitable society type issues. But media isn't mentioned in this as a process. It's kind of seen in a way as you can only think of media in one way. So reform of media is either we abolish capitalism, which in my experience I don't think is going to happen, and there's forms of capitalism. It depends what we're talking about. There's good examples and there's bad examples, in the same way that there's good examples of a kind of social provision as well as bad examples of that as well. So we've got to sort out which is the preferable element, but also the kind of sense that people think they get quite rigid about what the answers are. Well, as soon as we get rid of Murdoch, then all of a sudden the media will open up in a different way, and it's like, no, it's not going to happen like that. And it's still a kind of top-down kind of mentality, as if we change the high-level ideology, that'll filter down to the bottom. And it's like, kind of my experience is that actually that doesn't make much difference. And I'm looking to things in our media which are those things that make the difference. And arts practice is one thing. So I'm really fascinated with the women that you're working with at the moment, about what does engage them, what does get them, and how you make sense of that and get that form of engagement, and what they view as because that co-production element, as you say, is very fashionable to talk about co-production these days, but what does that mean in practice is always, and every issue that we put forward. So I'm a pragmatist in this sense, is that you ask the question, well, it's fine in theory, but how does it work in practice? And to work with a group of people in a specific situation from a specific time and culture, what is the benefit and what is the change that they agree with and consent to, which is supports them, rather than maybe standing from the outside. I pick up I used to read The Guardian for 40 years. Now I pick up The Guardian. It is like you do have to have a social justice degree to read it these days. It's like it's not. It's like there's so many things that you are made to feel as if you ought to be qualified in, which don't relate to the practical realities of what people are getting. The jobs that people do and the tasks. A mother, a carer, a sentinel is a phrase within a society. Care services, police services, fire services, or teachers. All of those things on a practical level, it's kind of like it gets a bit too abstract sometimes when you talk about it. Whereas when we talk about the practical engagement, so sorry, that kind of took us off on a bit of a tangent maybe. But how do you? So you kind of. And I hate this phrase as well. And I'll be interested to see what your reaction to my dislike of this phrase is. Wellbeing, the wellbeing model, because it's kind of brought into everything, isn't it? What's your experience taught you about what the value is of having a properly grounded, thought through, non-dogmatic sense of what wellbeing is as a practice?
I'm going to bring Audre Lorde into this because she talks about radical self-care, and this is really the idea of self-care that goes beyond the individualistic self, and this is what we're sold to within the capitalist infrastructure, that and through advertising, that we need to be taking care of ourselves as individualized units, and so that we can prosper in the world and acquire more capital and fill the pockets of the corporations while we're at it, and this sense of well-being is often, this is the popular sense of well-being that we all are now so familiar with, which is tied to capitalism and the products that they sell. But I guess my kind of discomfort with that was really about how does this look within the social justice space. And going back to Audre Lorde, when she talks about practicing radical self-care, yes, all of that is important, to take care of yourself, but then how does that rest that you have accumulated give you the resources and the energy and the attention to and the time to really give back to the community, which is where that care is really needed among people that aren't as privileged. And so that's what the radical self-care model looks like, that I care about, that yes, we can practice the self-care, but then we have to then use the care that we've received, because and also I looked at something called the feminist ethics of care as well. So this idea is we have all learned care from our caregivers in some way, shape or form, usually our parents, and then we model that to the children if we have them, and hopefully enhance on that as well. But if we haven't received that care, then how do we then learn to give that care to other people? So this is where the wellbeing industry can be useful. It can help us to practice and learn those methods of...
There's an interesting thing, and there was a report that came out from Ofcom a few weeks ago about the manosphere, and it was very critical of some of the figures like Andrew Tate, obviously, who there's court proceedings taking place at the moment. And I was kind of quite... the report was really unfounded. It talked about almost like creating a demonisation of spaces where particularly young men are seen as being radicalised because they're listening to people who talk about boundaries and about self-discipline. And the Jordan Peterson was criticised, and I've watched Jordan Peterson over the years and think he's a bit bonkers at times and thinks he speaks sense at other times, but it's not unfounded practical experience, if you like, that he's often offering. And I just wonder if this notion of care has become one-sided, as kind of so open. It's like, it's almost like indulge your children's every whim, and that's one a kind of an extreme model of care. Whereas care, I mean, I remember the model of my parents is like the I don't know what it's like for you, but wait till your dad gets home, put the fear of God into you. Didn't mean to say that my dad cared for us any less. He might have cared for us more, but it was the discipline element of it. And often we think of care as the prescriptions of care in a kind of society which have become so open and fluid and without boundaries. And I just wanted you to, because I've never really discussed this with anybody, this is new territory for me in a sense, if to get that duty of care, so those feminist duties of care, can you remember what they are? Or generally, it's not a test to see if you remember the 5 points, but it's what are they? But at what point does that? Where do you set boundaries? Where do you set limits to things? Respect and autonomy, all that kind of stuff. Because you can have empathy, but actually your empathy can override the care that you need to give for somebody if they're doing something which is, particularly if they're a child, adults are different, but if somebody's in a position where they're clearly going to harm themselves or do something detrimental to their longer term development, what have you learned from your practice about how to work with something like that?
I think you touched on it a little bit earlier with the elderly Indian women's group, and I'm not sure if I kind of explained well, but I think again the care, the infrastructures of care that we're maybe sort of circling around at the moment, and one of those is the familial structures, and another word which is equally problematic these days is empowerment, right? And so we do have a crisis of care among within the communities where we're not taking care of our elderly, and we just don't have the infrastructures. Certainly, that
and it's easier to pass it off to somebody else to say, well, there's a line in Doctor Who a few years ago where they were in the North Pole or something, and he walks into this space, and somebody says, they said, "Who are you?" And he's got his companion, and he says, and she says. He says, "I'm the doctor." He says, "And I'm his carer." And he says, "Yes, she cares, so I don't have to."
Yeah.
And I thought, that line has stuck with me. It's like we can parcel off the capacity for care.
Yes.
Because it goes with responsibility.
Exactly. We can contract someone to do it. And Trevor Noah said this really well. He said that they stole the village from us and they sold it back to us. And that's what they're doing. Every single thing that used to be taken care of by the village, by the matriarchy, a lot of the time is now being sold back to us through the capitalist model. And this is what I'm really interested in is within the Ways to Wellbeing project, because it does not only look at personal care, but it also looks at social structures as well. How do we build, and I'm not excluding men from this by any means, but I do feel like, there needs to be more sisterhood and matriarchal, infrastructures where women can really ground themselves, because it really was the women traditionally in pretty much, for as far as I know, every culture that had that provided a space for the children to be safe in. This is where the modeling would be happening. So that word empowerment, this is kind of what we're doing with the elderly women. It's reminding them about actually how much cultural influence they have even at that age, because because when I said, so a big discussion we had last week was about the older Indian women, and they feel disempowered by their own children because they're so used to the children coming in unannounced and they drop everything to make food for them. And my mother does it. This is something that Indian women just do. They just do it, and that's how they express their love and care, right? But they also were explaining how difficult that can be sometimes when they're actually planning something for themselves, and it's quite tiring, and there were all sorts of reasons why it wasn't always ideal, but they felt like an obligation to do it. And obviously there was probably a lot of guilt in them, the way they felt like they had to do that. So I was trying to teach them boundaries. I said, look, even if it means just saying to them, your child, sometimes I can't do it right now, I can do it for you in half an hour. So but also I was kind of reminding them that when the grandchild is upset with the parent, who do they go to? They go to the grandparent, don't they? So it's kind of reminding them about how much cultural influence they have within that family structure. So by actually having boundaries, which are not, refusing to do the duties of care, which clearly makes them very, very happy, and it's very important within the infrastructure of care in the family, not to stop doing it, but to prioritize self-care, and then you can sell. And that goes back to the radical self-care idea of Audre Lorde, So I guess it's moving that kind of power to the top again. How do we move that power back into the elders?
There's an interesting process which is taking place, which is we think dominantly about process. Excuse me. So we have a kind of thinking where we parent, it's become parenting, mothering, fathering. It's like it's a process that you are part of. No longer the archetypal role of parent, mother, father. It's become, that's what you have a status within society as that parent, which is, I'm not saying that it should always be kind of set in stone, but there's an element to this which has kind of been, well, that was a generation ago where parents had this kind of authority and played this kind of role. Now everything's negotiable, and there's a self-help manual there for everybody to adopt and to optimise your parenting skills. So children have become regulated, and you can test the efficiency of your parenting by certain observable outcomes with your children, and it's something which is kind of divorced. So the challenge of this current generation of parents is that they don't see themselves as parents. They see themselves as facilitators of their children's well-being first, rather than as parents first, which is a kind of well-established historical social role. And they don't have confidence to act as that parent and to do the things, again, not without question, but the element of it, which is the counterproductive element, is people have become very intrusive to the lives of their children, where they're helicopter parents, and the children's lives are mapped out, and they don't go out and just play by themselves, and they don't have. My sister's a childminder, and she gets children. Who just don't know how to play on their own, because they're always supervised by their parents, and they've always got an activity planned. There's always something there which has got some kind of purpose, and a lot of what she does is disengages those children from that purpose and say, no, you're bored. Good, you're going to be bored for the next couple of hours. Figure something out to do, and that kind of space for people. The point I suppose I'm trying to get to is that element of the shift and change about roles. And the expectations around those roles is quite kind of, we're living through a period of quite significant change, which has been informed by things like social media, globalised media, migration, and make it where we are to make sense in all of this. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. I'll jump in to ask you another question, because what role do you think our media is playing with that, either positively or negatively?
That's another great question. I guess, I'm not a parent, so I can't speak with any kind of authority on that subject. But what I do see, as someone who likes to look at cultural, like pop media and pop culture, is social media, and kind of how you have these kind of models of perfect living being represented through social media. And there's an author called Wendy Brown. She calls it the entrepreneurial self-investor, and I guess she's kind of talking about how we're now expected to be all things to all people. We are this living, walking, talking brand for ourselves, and we do that through this perfectly curated image that we present on social media. And I guess parents have it really hard, because they have to be showing themselves to be, all singing, all dancing, the perfect parents. And I guess it comes down to like really knowing who you are and how to be. And like on the one hand, you've got to be this really successful kind of person at work and parent, but then also now there's this whole movement of getting back to nature. So it's kind of this boho image of being a little bit carefree as well. But how can you be really carefree when when
Instagram demands that you're posting your carefree moments and you have to schedule it? Yeah,
that's one part of it. But you've had this very opulent lifestyle, which involves big holidays, and you even have family vloggers who literally make a whole living, and it's really attractive. When I was following a few for a while, I was thinking, God, they look like they had the perfect life, and they've got 3 kids on tow, and they're traveling the world, and it's an attractive kind of image of what a family is supposed to look like,
But it's a fantasy.
It is. Well, I guess it's a reality for them, but I'm sure I suppose the problem is where they're only really talking about the good parts. Often they're not. We don't get to see the bits that are not working so well. So I guess I'm always. I love seeing some of this stuff, but at the same time, I try not to get too seduced by what I'm being shown, because the reality, I try to stay in my own lane in terms of what I'm interested in, and it's nice to see people enjoying time with their families and things, but I guess I'm more interested in how people are actually making their way through the world in an everyday context. Like you said, that's a fantasy. That's like the kind of dream that people might present to the world, but the reality.
Which the reality intrudes, people riding past on noisy motorbikes.
Thank you. I couldn't have finished that better.
Yeah, it's a synchronicity, I think.
Yeah.
The interesting side of this, so you're involved with a community radio station in Leicester as well. I want you to tell me that kind of thinking about that So one of the things that with community radio, I always get the first thing that you have to do with new volunteers when you're training them is they have to unlearn what they've learned about radio, because most people come rightly, you know, it's very attractive, but they come with an expectation of a certain type of persona that they've learned from listening to other forms of radio or media, and certain types of personality projection, and you kind of have to go, well, that's not you. So what we want to do is strip that away and take it back to basics and show you who you are, what you're interested in, why you are an interesting person, not a wannabe of a 1980s style Radio 1 DJ, something like that, yeah. Smashy and nicey kind of stuff. So how does this fit, and what's your kind of guidance and advice about your thinking around this kind of way of tell us what you do with the radio station you're involved in.
I think we might have got our wires crossed. I'm the chair of Too Funky, but I'm not involved with the radio at all.
No, but you advise.
More like on the board, we kind of
Right.
look at more, you know, the overarching kind of themes of where the projects are going. So I'm not too involved in what's happening on the radio, but I think I can probably answer that question in a different way, if that's okay. Just before the motorcycles went past and we were talking about the family, you know, Instagram family and all of this, I guess before we started recording, Rob and I were speaking about, you know, like how we can actually transport ourselves to a different moment in time, and, you know, like especially the weather as it is at the moment. I was sitting in my back garden this morning and it felt like I was in Spain, and, you know, I guess they're the lessons, whether you're an Instagram family or whether we're sitting here right now, you know, really trying to cultivate that presence in the mind where we can actually just enjoy being who we are and where we are at the moment, rather than trying to be somewhere else and someone else, you know, trying to live somebody else's fantasy and dream. So I'm not sure if I've answered that question very well.
No, I think that I would far be it for me to recommend that, you know, how you appreciate you know, organise one of this, you know, Too Funky, but I think that's very good. I think that's much needed advice. There's an awful lot of an industry of projection out there, you know, as you say, it's kind of the capitalist system. How do you make money? How do you get clicks? How do you get likes? How do you have a presence on social media? You build a persona and you build something up, and it's like kind of, it's actually counterproductive, and it's making people less happy, less satisfied. Whereas if you strip all of that away and you just, you know, you pull away from the projection of something, and you actually just, it's a group of people who are themselves, whatever that means, but it's like a group of people who are more relaxed around each other and got a certain sense of shared identity and a certain shared interest in something, and that's your starting point for something. Whereas I think we get lost with a lot of our media by always assuming that there's a kind of a, you know, that kind of corporate communications kind of machine that needs to be fed, and you're just one of the, you know, one of the foot soldiers who's, you know, going to be pushed up to the front lines at some point to the Instagram and the X and Facebook, you know, skirmishes that are out there, and it's kind of, it's not, there isn't a sense of satisfaction that perhaps goes with it. So.
Exactly, and I think, you know, we were kind of, again, this might sound a bit left field, but stay with me. So you probably heard this saying where yesterday's news is today's fish and chip paper or something like that. And the digital economy, it's even less time before it becomes irrelevant. You're talking about 5 minutes or something, you know. So going back to kind of like, you know, people's attention, you know, how do we cultivate spaces and opportunities for people to really cultivate that sense of presence within what they're doing, and that's whether it's in the art making or whether it's in the yoga or whatever. But I mean, I don't use social media very much for myself, but, you know, I'm playing with it a little bit here and there, and I'm like, you know, in Islam they call it zikr, which is the meditation of living in meditation all day, every day. You know, the idea is you don't need to go to a mountain to meditate on your own. You know, you find ways to meditate in whatever you're doing. That's washing up or you're making
it's like that bliss.
That bliss. That's right. That bliss. And, obviously I can sit here and say that and it doesn't make any sense to someone who's maybe taking their kids to school or bringing their kids from school right now. But, I guess it's just trying to help. And I suppose it's not me telling people that's what they should do, but I think the capitalist model is trying to get people to be producing, and it's the whole kind of American hustle culture, isn't it, of the soccer moms who are like taking their kids from one activity to the next and never really enjoying any of it. So how do we within our own lives decide what are the most important, meaningful things that I'm doing, and how can I, because yoga is that actually. Yoga is a lifestyle, and, moving into Ayurveda, which it translates to the science of life, it's not about adding more stuff, it's about taking away the stuff that's not working. So that's what capitalism kind of is. It's like you're just piling on more and more and more and more stuff, and you're just buried in all this nonsense, and you don't even know what makes you happy. So how do we start peeling away all those layers of the false self and identity and getting through to the gold, the stuff that really keeps you content, So that's kind of where I am anyway, and I try to help people to find that within their own lives.
Well, if I find that answer, then I will share it with you. No, I did have a nice moment over the weekend where I was kind of sat in my sun lounger in the shade with the amongst my bedding plants and weeds, enjoying lots of insects, lots of bees and butterflies out this weekend. And that was one of those moments where it's kind of like just disengage and chill out, and more moments like that. So what kind of, let's wrap up and kind of, what kind of media, what's engaging you at the moment? What is it are you reading? Are you watching a series? Is there anything that you're listening to which you kind of think you'd recommend that would help you to find that, that's helped you to find that moment of gold when you get caught up in a book or something?
Yeah, thank you. I'm at the moment I'm listening to an audio book by someone called David Hawkins, PhD, and it's called Letting Go. And he talks about different levels of consciousness, and I hope this might summarize a lot of what we talked about actually. And he talks about kind of different states of being, which at the bottom, and it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but he goes into way more detail. So at the bottom of this kind of ladder is things are feelings and emotions like shame and guilt and fear, anger, those kinds of things, and he puts them into a kind of scale of consciousness. And as you kind of start to rise up this, beyond and rise up beyond these feelings of anger and shame, which essentially is trauma, right, into layers of acceptance and love and joy and peace and happiness and fulfillment and these kinds of things. And then it's also measured in a vibrational kind of thing, so it's a spiritual kind of teaching as much as it is a practical, theoretical, psychological teaching. And at the top you've got like I said, I think it's 12 levels or something like that. And the top you have like Jesus and Muhammad and the Buddha and people like that who are living in this constant state of bliss. And I think if I can just achieve that for a few moments, like in my garden, I'm good. So I'm taking a lot from that. And it's a very easy audio book to listen to, but I think that that's been really transformative for me.
Wonderful. Well, let's meet again soon for another conversation, because I've really enjoyed this one, and it's taken us into a very different territory for what I've covered in the past in the podcast, and it'll be nice to explore some of these issues in greater depth and more detail in coming episodes. So thank you very much again. And have you somewhere where people can contact you? Is that?
You can go to my website, kajalpatel.com. And everything is on there. So that's it.
Wonderful. Okay, if you are a supporter of Decentered Media, go to the website, which is decentered.co.uk, and it's on social media at Decentered Media. Yeah, that's correct. And if you want to be a Patreon supporter, that will help. But until next time, thank you very much. You've been listening to the Decentered Media podcast with me, Rob Watson. To find out more, go to decentered.co.uk or follow on Twitter and Instagram at Decentered Media.